It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Andrew Barton to the Farmington Rotary Club. Dr. Barton has requested to speak to Farmington Rotary on the topic of carbon fee and dividend. Drew grew up in the mountains of Western North Carolina, inspired by his dad's love of the outdoors and his mom's commitment to education. He received his bachelor's degree from Brown University and then his PhD in biology from the University of Michigan. Drew moved to UMF and Farmington with his wife, Sarah Sloan, also a biology professor, with their young children in 1996 to build a better life and career. They lived on the Weeks Mills Road on 125 acres next to Henry and Teresa Hardy's dairy farm since 1999. Drew is a forest and fire ecologist, science writer, and professor of biology at UMF. His research focuses on how forests are responding to climate change and to the intensification of wildfires. His current research takes him to the forests of Arizona, where he is carrying out field work and using data from the new NASA EcoStress instrument from the space station to better understand forest recovery after wildfires in a warmer and drier world. His book, The Changing Nature of the Maine Woods, tells the story of how the forests of Maine have changed over the past 10,000 years and how they are changing today. He is also the co-author of the recent book, Ecology and Recovery of Old Growth Forests in Eastern North America. He spends much of his time teaching courses in biology to UMF students and helping to prepare Maine for climate change. Please join me in welcoming Drew to the Farmington Rotary.
Well, thank you so much for giving me a little bit of your time. It's been a while since I've talked with you all. I was trying to reflect back when the last time was, and it was actually just before the Education Center was built. So that's about 16 years ago, something like that. And so I gave a talk on some of the remarkable green features of the building. So that building, of course, came to pass, and I'm really happy to say that it lowered UMF's carbon footprint and has been saving UMF $50,000 a year for 16 years. So that has accumulated over time. So, I don't usually talk much about kind of policy sorts of things. I give a lot of talks all across Maine about science and to try to help people understand why the nature of Maine looks the way it does. Why do our forests look the way they do? How are they changing and why are they changing? But I was really motivated to come talk to you all about this particular issue, in part because there is an article that will be voted on at the town meeting, and I thought that I would take a little bit of time to sort of explain it and maybe help prepare everybody to think about it a little bit. So with that, let me dive right in. If I could share my screen, if you could give me control over that.
Yes, you have it.
Okay, thank you. It's great to see all of your faces. I wish I could be there in person. So many of you know me from my work with the Sustainable Campus Coalition at UMF. I help run the Fiddlehead Festival and the composting program with the town and many other things like that. So it's great to at least see your faces virtually. So here's what I want to get to, is this carbon cashback program, which I think it's not an exaggeration to say that it is kind of sweeping the nation as an alternative to government regulation to deal with climate change. It's a bipartisan idea. You will see that this idea emerges from conservative thinkers, but is being embraced across the spectrum. So let me start by just kind of updating you a little bit about climate change and bring you right up to date to the year 2020. I think everybody that's on my screen knows that the problem is that we're burning a lot of fossil fuels and that this is releasing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that this is accumulating in the atmosphere and forming sort of a blanket over the earth, and that these greenhouse gases trap heat, and that then translates into hotter temperatures and many other impacts, which we call climate change. Now, we know this really well for a whole bunch of reasons. We have a lot of certainty about it. And I'll just real quickly just tell you a couple of those. So one of them is that the principles underlying climate change and this heat trapping properties of greenhouse gases is a fundamental principle of physics that we've known since the late 1800s. The second is we look back over millions of years, we can see that periods where carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere are high, those are warmer periods, and periods when they're low are cooler periods. Finally, because of the absolutely remarkable technology that is on satellites and the space station and available on the ground as well, we can actually measure how much heat is being trapped by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It's pretty remarkable to see how far we've come in the last couple of decades. So let me just real quickly give you an update on where we are in the year 2021. So these are measurements of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere that are taken at the NOAA Observatory at the top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. So these are parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this has been measured at the same instrument since the 1950s all the way up to today. And you can see in the 1950s, the levels were at about at 315 parts per million. And February of 2021, we were at 417 parts per million. So that's a 1/3 increase. That is a really significant increase in a heat trapping gas. These are the highest values now that we've seen in hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. So this is significant. And what that is translating into is this. And so this is the heating of the earth by those heat trapping greenhouse gases. We're going to focus here on carbon, but there are others as well, nitric oxides, methane, and some others also. Now, I'm focusing here on temperature, but of course we know that climate change is a lot more than just temperature, but this helps us a lot, I think. So this shows from thermometers. By the way, we can measure temperature multiple ways these days, from satellites, from ground-based instruments, from old-fashioned thermometers, and many other ways as well. So this goes from the late 1800s up to 2020. And so you can see the last about 42 to 45 years, there has been a continuous increase in the average temperature of the Earth annually. 2020 was the second hottest year on record. The hottest 10 years in the entire record have happened over the last 15 years. Now, is this something that we need to be concerned about in Maine? Has Maine actually warmed or not? And how does it compare to the entire planet? I think most people that have been in Maine for a long time would probably be shaking their heads up and down and say, yeah, it is definitely warmer now. And it is, so Maine is warming. Here are the most recent data. These are collected by the Climate Change Institute, a bunch of professors at the University of Maine in Orono. And look at that middle line. So this goes from the late 1800s in Maine up to 2020. And you can see that Maine has warmed by about 3.2 degrees overall. So this is the average. There's the global average. And so you'll notice that Maine has warmed just about twice as fast as the entire Earth together. That's partly because we are at a northern latitude. One of the interesting things that you can see here is at the top is, well, how much has maximum temperature increased, daily maximum temperature averaged over the year, and then at the bottom is minimum temperature. And what you can see is that although both of these have risen since the late 1800s, it is the minimum temperature that has risen more. In other words, we're having less cold, real cold periods than we did a century ago and 50 years ago, et cetera. Now, it turns out that the warming is much more in the winter than it is in other seasons. So Maine winters have risen by about 5.1 degrees over the last 120 years or so. So anyone who has lived in Maine for a really long time and tells you that winters today are nothing like they were when they were young, turns out that they're absolutely correct about that. Now, I'm going to show you the next two images I find just a little bit frightening, especially economically. And so the first one is that the Gulf of Maine is the second fastest warming marine body of water in the entire world. This is for a variety of reasons. All ocean temperatures have gone up, but the Gulf of Maine in particular has warmed a lot. This could, in the long run, by the way, this rising trend is projected to increase over the next several decades and increase a lot unless we make some really significant changes in our emissions of greenhouse gases. The threat, of course, is to one of the big economic engines in Maine, and that is the cold water fishery, and lobsters are by far the largest component of the cold water fishery in the Gulf of Maine. So lobsters rely on cold waters, and as things warm, this fishery will slowly move to the north. Will it be in 10 years, or 20 years, or 30 years, or 40 years? We don't really know. But in the long run, we're moving towards warmer waters, and that's bad for lobsters. This has actually already happened off the coast of Rhode Island and Long Island as well. So those fisheries have declined as those waters have warmed. They're higher than Maine. They started higher than Maine, so they warmed to a point where those lobster fisheries are reduced compared to where they were 30 years ago and 40, et cetera. Another real concern, and this may be the biggest economic threat of all of climate change to Maine, and that is sea level rise. So that blue squiggly line there shows the sea level at the Portland tide gauge. And you can see since the early 1900s, it's gone up about 8 inches or so. And those on the right side of the graph, the red and the gray, are the projections for the future, given what is happening now. And the concern is, if you look to the far right, you could see by the end of the century, the projections are somewhere between about a couple of feet up to about 4 feet, 5 feet. There's some projections that suggest that if we continue following business as usual, make no significant changes, that it could be as much as 6, 7, even 8 feet. Even 2 or 3 feet will have really important economic impacts on low-lying coastal areas in Maine, including the seafront in Casco Bay, so Portland, and many others as well. So there have been a lot of projections, economic projections about how many people will be displaced, how many businesses will be displaced, et cetera. So this is, I think, a real concern and something that a lot of people, especially on the coast, are beginning to prepare for. How can they adapt to this? Now, another concern, of course, not surprise to you, I'm sure, given everything I've told you so far, is the projections are for less snow overall. You can see where we are, we're in that 20 to 40% band. You can see that Sugarloaf and Sunday River and Saddleback are in that less than 20% band. The other issue economically is that the forecast is for the snow season to be shorter. So in terms of skiing and tourism in the winter, a shorter season with less snow. This is the last one sort of catching you all up on what we know about climate change as of the year 2021. But this shows that black line is the temperature since the late 1800s, which again has gone up. And then those 3 lines to the right side of the graph show the projections for the future. There are 2 things about this. One of them a little scary and the other a little, more optimistic. So the scary part is that really, no matter what we do, we have just begun the warming and climate change process on planet Earth and in Maine as well. The part that I take a little bit of hope from is that notice that we can still have a really huge impact on which of those lines we follow. The top line, the red line, is the business as usual model. That is, we pretty much don't really make any big changes. Notice that takes us to somewhere between 10 and 14 degrees increase. So a 10 degree increase in Maine would pretty much make Maine like Virginia. The green line there is for making some significant changes, and the blue line is for making really revolutionary changes in the way that we run our economies across the earth. So the question is, how can we follow the blue or the green line? Those are changes that at least a state like Maine and a country like the United States can adapt to. So the question is, what can we do to make sure that we don't follow that red line? We need a lot of big ideas. And I don't have time here to talk about all the big ideas. There are a lot. I think I'm optimistic because that's kind of what we do in this country. We come up with big ideas, we implement them effectively, and we solve problems. And I think this is a solvable problem. And I want to talk about just one of those. I want to talk about this big idea, which is called carbon cash back. It is a bipartisan alternative to carbon regulations. You will see that this idea kind of emerged and grew from some leading conservative thinkers, but it's being embraced across the political spectrum. So let me dive into it and show you how this works. And I'm sure you'll have a whole bunch of questions about this that I'll be happy to take up. So here's the idea. There are 3 steps to this simple program, which again is an alternative to government regulations regulating the use or the burning of fossil fuels and releasing of carbon. So number 1 is place a steadily rising carbon fee on fossil fuels. Now, when you burn a fossil fuel again, it releases carbon dioxide and it goes into the atmosphere, and we can actually measure that. We know how much carbon dioxide comes out of a gallon of gas, for example, and goes into the atmosphere. So the idea is that in the first year of the program, we would start by charging $15 per metric ton of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere from the burning of a fossil fuel. Each year after that, this would rise by $10 a ton. The idea here, of course, is to encourage the purchase of cleaner energy and would provide a disincentive for purchasing fossil fuels. The other really important thing is that this would stimulate innovation into low carbon technologies, manufacturing technologies, energy technologies, even things like removing carbon from the air. Now, here is the difference between this idea and regulatory ideas, and that is 100% of these fees, minus some small administrative costs, would actually be returned to US households. This would compensate for any higher prices for fuels, for energy, for other goods, etc. I'll show you some actual numbers on this in a moment, but for most households, what this would mean is that the dividends that households receive would actually be higher than the increase in the costs. Now, there's a third really important thing. In order to prevent any movement of manufacturing, of energy production, et cetera, overseas, there would be a border adjustment fee to stop reallocation overseas. There would be import fees on countries that don't have a carbon fee. That would make the playing field level. It would also encourage other countries to begin pricing carbon as well. There would be rebates to US companies exporting to those countries that don't have a carbon fee. Now, this has been around for a few years, and as you can imagine, there have been many independent analyses of this by economic and energy firms. And I'm going to show you sort of a summary of their results, so what they think the implications of this approach would be. By the way, on the right are some of the firms and agencies, et cetera, that have actually done quantitative economic analyses of this. Here's what they have concluded. They've concluded that this carbon cash back program would reduce carbon emissions by 52%, that a $10 ton carbon fee would add 11 cents to the price of a gallon of gas. Of course, this would happen every year, just full disclosure about this, that there would be a cost of living increase that's connected to this carbon cash back program of about 2% by the year 2035. Now, these changes, these increases, if you think about how much the price of gas has changed over the last 10 years, 20 years, I'm 64 years old. So I remember when gas was super cheap. And then I remember when it went extremely high. And then when it came way down a few years ago, and now it's kind of creeping back up just a little bit. So the changes that I'm showing you here are well within that sort of range of variation, if you will. Here is the key point again, and that is those dividends that go to households. The projections by all of these firms is that something like 2/3 of households would actually come out ahead. In other words, the dividends would be more than their increased costs. And here is a really important thing, at least from my perspective, and that is 96% of the households that are in the bottom 1/5 in terms of income would come out ahead. So in that sense, this is a fair approach, an equitable approach that won't hurt people who really can't afford this at all, can't afford to lose money on something like this. The analyses suggest that this would generate 2.8 million new jobs over 20 years from all of these new technologies. It would save 230,000 lives over 20 years. Now, this is not because it would reduce carbon dioxide emissions. This is because it would reduce the emissions of air pollutants that are released when you burn fossil fuels. These are sulfur dioxide and nitric oxides, and these lay a heavy burden on children, on older people, and on people that have compromised respiratory systems. So those that have emphysema, asthma, etc. So this is a problem we have today, and this would help solve that problem as well. Here is one of the keys, I think, that make a program like this attractive across the spectrum. This is not a government program that will add to government coffers. It is nearly revenue neutral. Again, the fees that are levied go back to households. They don't go into the government budget. So this is a really important part of this program. Now, where did this come from? So here is the team that has kind of come up with the most recent sort of formulation of this idea. They published this initially in the Wall Street Journal in 2017, in the New York Times, and many other publications. There is a detailed foreign affairs article that came out this past May and June. And here are the three people who really have headed up this whole idea. So, and those of you that have followed politics for a while probably recognize at least two of them. James Baker is the lead author of this program. So James Baker was President Reagan's Secretary of the Treasury. He was then George Bush Sr.'s Secretary of State. George Shultz, who just died recently, may he rest in peace, was the Secretary of the Treasurer for the Nixon administration, the Ford administration, Secretary of State for the Reagan administration. And Ted Halstead is the leader, CEO of the Climate Leadership Council, which is a kind of a coalition of leading major corporations, Fortune 500 corporations in the United States, and environmental groups, and some other opinion makers. So this coalition that spans the entire political spectrum. Here are a few quotes from this article. By the way, you can access this easily online and read the whole article. So here's a couple quotes. The winner of the emerging clean energy race will determine the economic and geopolitical balance of power for decades to come. These provisions would align the economic interests of ordinary Americans with climate progress. The higher the carbon fee, the lower the carbon emissions, and the higher the dividend to all Americans. A rising carbon fee is the most powerful tool to unleash the innovative power of the private sector. Once a technology had proved its commercial viability, the fee would propel its wide and rapid deployment. Now, I think part of what's happening right now is that it is becoming clear to just about everybody that carbon pricing is coming. That there's just about no other approach that's going to have this sort of power. But the concern is to do carbon pricing in a way that doesn't impose a regulatory burden and doesn't unfairly cost people who cannot afford it. So this idea of carbon pricing is being adopted by many countries across the world, and it's being embraced again across the political spectrum. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Let me turn your attention to the right side. So this is the US and the International Chamber of Commerce. And so I'll real quickly read this quote. The International Chamber of Commerce recognizes the urgent need to keep the global temperature increase below 1.5 degrees Celsius and work towards net zero emissions by 2050. Climate action is everyone's business, and achieving our collective climate goals will require a mix of voluntary action and coherent policy frameworks. This flagship report from the High-Level Commission on Carbon Pricing and Competitiveness is a critical contribution to this debate. The report presents the case for carbon pricing as one of the policy drivers to a low carbon economy. And in the press release from the US Chamber of Commerce was this quote, "Leading on climate is smart for business." So again, the idea is that carbon pricing is on its way. And the idea is, how can we do this in a way that it will actually stimulate the economy and not add unnecessary regulatory burdens. Here, just as an example, in 2019 is all the legislation that was introduced into the Federal House of Representatives. You can see there are a lot. The idea of carbon cash back or carbon fee and dividend is on the far left. And again, the idea is this is a bipartisan idea that doesn't involve government regulations. The money that is raised from this goes right back to US households. Now, again, the reason that I'm bringing all this up is to help prepare myself, honestly, but everyone else in town, as many as possible, for a vote that's coming up at the town meeting in Farmington in April. And this is Article 27. So this is how this reads. To see if the town will vote to urge its federal elected officials to enact national cashback carbon pricing that charges fossil fuel producers for the carbon pollution emitted by their products and rebates the money collected to all legal US residents on an equal basis with monthly dividend checks. The record of the vote approving this article shall be transmitted by written notice to Farmington state legislators, members of Congress, the governor of Maine, the president of the United States, by the Board of Selectmen within 30 days of this vote. So the selectmen voted to actually put this article up for a vote after being petitioned by a group of citizens. Now, as I was putting this together, I thought maybe I should actually find out what the Rotary Club is doing about climate change and some of the discussions. And of course, no big surprise, the Rotary Club is way ahead of me by a long shot. And so here's just a little bit. There was a Rotarian issue that was devoted to climate solutions within our reach. On the website, there's a lot of information about why climate change is important to Rotary business. There's an entire climate change series, et cetera. One of the things I've always admired about the Rotary Club, and I hope it's okay that I actually use this, is this 4-point test that the Rotary Club uses. And I always sort of bring that to mind when I'm thinking about actions that I might carry out in my community or in my state, policies and other things like that. And so I'm trying to, think about climate change and think about this article and sort of how does it measure up to this? So again, I know that the Rotary Club is, that you don't get involved in policy per se, but all of you that live in Farmington will, be at the meeting and have a chance to vote on this. And I just wanted to bring this up to everybody to, again, help everyone sort of think about it a little bit. And again, I myself have kind of used this test for it, and I'm not going to go on about why I like it, but again, I just wanted to put this forth and see what you all think and then open it up to questions. So with that, I'll stop talking and see if you guys have any questions.
Any questions?
Let me stop sharing. Sorry. There.
I have a question. Is there any concern that the carbon, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought, that the cash back to people would disincentivize them from kind of monitoring their own carbon footprint? Does that make sense? Like individuals who are.
Yeah, so the idea of this is that the rational thing for any household to do would be to be happy about getting the dividend. But because fossil fuel forms of energy will be more costly than renewable forms of energy, then they'll purchase renewable forms of energy. As an example, people will have more incentive to buy heat pumps, mini splits, to heat their houses rather than oil, because heating your house with oil will slowly over time become a little more expensive. And so going to things like heat pumps will relatively be less expensive. So that's sort of part of the idea. There'll also be an incentive, for example, apparently GM is going completely to electric cars by 2035, but in the meantime, most of us are going to be, at least in Farmington, using gas. But the incentive will be to buy a car that gets better gas mileage because gas prices will be going up. So as a family, you'll be able to save money if you buy a car that has better gas mileage, if you figure out ways to drive a little bit less, if you walk a little more, all those sorts of things. So the idea is that families will be incentivized to move to sort of a low carbon and low fossil fuel approach to everything in their lives, because they'll save money by doing that. So that's sort of the, in the Foreign Affairs article by James Baker and Schultz and Halstead, they talk about this at the level of manufacturing in the United States and how this will stimulate all these new technologies to take advantage of a low carbon economy. But I think this works also at the individual and family and community level as well.
Joseph O'Brien has a question.
Good morning. Hi, Andrew. Thank you for coming.
Sure.
I noticed in your data, you went back to 1880 and you said there was a 1 degree C temperature change since that time frame. I've got kind of an issue trying to do measurements globally back in 1880. I know that that didn't happen, so there were many different exchanges. Probably getting core samples out of Antarctic would have helped the most to get ice samples. But in particular, we do have really good data with solar flares. And those solar flares, we're on cycle number 25 right now that started in 2020. And those cycles last 11-year cycles. They all go all the way back to include the Maunder minimum and then the Dalton minimum. Maunder minimum in the 1600s, and in the 1700s, there was a Dalton minimum. Now, NASA is saying that solar cycle number 25 is going to be significantly low, and solar cycle number 26 is basically going to be close to zero. Have those numbers been rolled in? Because that is very close to a global cooling kind of arrangement where we've got to be looking at a little ice age compared to the Dalton minimum.
Yeah, those numbers are included. We're actually, we have incredibly high resolution measurements of all the sources of heat on the Earth. So I don't have time to show you those measurements, but we actually can measure to how many watts per meter square is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we've added is adding to the Earth. How much are changes from what's coming from the sun? How much has that added per meter square in terms of temperature, et cetera, and many other things as well. So we are measuring and able to measure all of those inputs now, both now and to project them into the future. And so given all of that, we know with high certainty that greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are responsible for that temperature rise curve, and the projection for the future is continued increases regardless of those cycles.
You're saying regardless of those cycles, during the Maunder minimum and the Dalton minimum, areas like the Thames River in London have froze. And you can even see sketches of where people were playing ice games out on the Thames River in London.
Sure.
So that is so unusual compared to temperatures of today. We're not looking at a 1 degree C temperature change. You're looking at more of a 5 or 10 degree C temperature change.
Right. So again, what I can tell you is that all of these projections take all of those changes into consideration. And the amount of warming that's happening because of greenhouse gases will overwhelm any of those variations that are attributable to solar input.
I have a hard time believing that, since the satellite data has, from the Jason satellite in particular, has only been available for about the last 7 years.
So those numbers that go back to the late 1800s, we had thermometers in Maine starting in the 1860s that were measuring, really high quality thermometers that have been measuring temperature now for 150 years. So those are all thermometer measurements that we're showing there. Now we can back all those up with more modern satellite measurements. We can back those up with tree ring measurements. We can back those up with ice cores. Just real quickly, the way ice cores work is that every year there is a layer of ice that is laid down. It gets a little bit squashed. It traps gases, gas bubbles within it. Inside the gas bubble, we can measure what's in there, and we can measure temperature for every single year going back hundreds of thousands of years. We can also measure carbon dioxide concentrations that were in the atmosphere at that time. So we can back all those up with ice core measurements as well. But the data that I actually showed you are thermometer measurements. So Maine had a really impressive network starting more than a century ago of thermometers actually in Maine. So that's what those data are. We've had satellite measurements for more than 7 years. That one satellite, yes, that's true, but we've had satellite measurements for longer than that. But I haven't shown you any satellite data. That's all thermometers.
Frank Undercuffler has a question.
Yeah, I basically two things, Drew, that was interesting to know if you wanted to comment. One is that there have been a number of folks who have said that the conversion to electric cars is great in principle, but the problem is that where's the electricity going to come from, and how's it going to be distributed on the scale necessary to be useful for electric cars. And some folks have said that the only practical way to do that would be to return to nuclear energy. So first, we have to reopen Maine Yankee. The second question I have is that in terms of population, I think there's a definite link between global climate change, use of carbon, and number of people who are using carbon. There doesn't seem to be nearly as much interest in the effect that a rising human population on the Earth has on climate change. And so if you'd like to comment on either one of those, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll start with the second and then I'll go back to the first. So yeah, there's been a lot less emphasis on population, and I think for a couple of reasons. One is that it's a very, like having children is a very personal thing. So I think increasingly people have been reluctant to put pressure on people about their decision about having children or how many children to have. That's kind of been a non-starter. I think the other thing is that although it'd be nice to have fewer people than we have now in terms of environmental impact, most of the projections show that the global population will level out over the next half a century or so. There'll be too many people for sure, but it's not like a rising population that's going to approach 100 billion or anything like that.
Not like Paul Ehrlich, in other words.
Exactly, yes. Now, part of the reason is that we have a better understanding of the connection between development and family decisions about how many children to have and the impact of that on population growth. So basically what happens is as societies develop, that families have fewer children. They don't have as much time to have so many children. Children, this sounds really funny to say this, but there's less incentive to have children to work on the farm, for example. And they cost more, so you can't afford as many. So there's a real connection there. Back to nuclear energy, we definitely are going to have to upgrade the grid, for sure, to accommodate electric cars. It's possible to do, and I think it will be done. This, of course, plays into the whole CMP proposal, which is an issue I'm not going to touch on really here at all. But nuclear energy is funny. I'm old enough so that I actually protested at Seabrook in New Hampshire. I was in Rhode Island a long time ago, but don't tell anybody this. But I'm open to talking about nuclear energy as part of the mix, to be honest. I'm open to maybe we need to think about this. You know, it's still got problems. The whole waste disposal thing is a really big deal. There's, of course, the whole danger of meltdowns, but there are safer plants now. So I'm willing to, I feel like we need to, it has to be in there and we have to at least talk about it. as part of a mix. We're going to have to do a lot of things, and
Kim
not just
Russo has a
one or two
question.
things. Yeah.
Kim?
Yeah, I think this is, my question is actually a good segue from that. You showed the graph of like, you know, no change, moderate change, significant change. And I just sort of wanted to hear two things. Like, you know, in my mind, those sources are probably wind, solar, you know, you just touched on nuclear. I'd love to hear what you think those solutions are and which one is the most sustainable currently.
Yeah, again, I think we're going to have to do a whole bunch of things. I think we're going to have some sort of carbon pricing. I think carbon pricing will go a long way. I really personally like this carbon cashback program because it doesn't get involved in government regulation. Money doesn't go into government coffers, and that appeals to me a lot. So I really think that this proposal can go a long way. I think that we're going to have a lot more investment in some new technologies, that electric cars, for example, we're going to have better batteries so that I could actually buy an electric car in Farmington. I mean, I know at Hannaford there are charging stations, but it's still not really practical for me to get an all electric car. So we're going to have better batteries. We're going to have to, you know, create a lot of new technologies that use that are better, more efficient at energy use. I think that, let me think of other things that we're going to have to really invest in figuring out ways to try to take carbon out of the air. I think this is another thing. This is sort of in that nuclear category. Some of the proposals don't appeal to me because I'm a little concerned about the unintended consequences of them. So for example, I'm not really a supporter of putting mirrors in the air and blocking the sun because of unintended consequences. You know, we always have to think about what could possibly go wrong, and we're not very good at doing that, are we? And so, but I do think we have to figure out ways to take more carbon out of the air. We're so beyond sort of where we need to be. We're going to have to figure out how can we suck some of that carbon out of the air. Actually, one of my colleagues here, Doug Royce, is working on sort of geological solutions to that. So how can we use, there are certain rock types that actually are really good at taking up carbon dioxide, and how can we use those to actually take carbon out of the air? I think we're going to have to put a lot of money into that. And
Dr. Barguin has a question.
Well, actually, I don't have a question so much as a comment on your reference to Rotary, which I very much appreciate you doing.
Yeah.
But I wanted to add a little bit more fuel to your fire on that, in the fact that the Rotary Foundation, which is the charitable branch of all of Rotary, has established for about 8 years what are called the 6 areas of focus for their global grants, you know, for their larger grants that they put out there. And they came upon those 6 areas of focus because that's what Rotary clubs were already funding. You know, those were the things they were already doing. Water projects, such as you heard earlier that Al Feather referred to, maternal health, child health, economic development and such. But as of July 1 of this year, they have now established a 7th area of focus. And that, of course, concentrates on our environment. So, and they are doing that because for the last 5 years, they've given out $18 million in grants that have been associated with protecting the environment.
Wow.
So they have seen that this is something that Rotary clubs throughout the world are interested in doing. So they have now established that as the 7th area of focus. So you were right on when you said that Rotary was kind of ahead of the game on this. And it's because that's what Rotary clubs throughout the world have been focusing on themselves.
That's great to know. Thanks so much for telling me. And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I know a lot of the focus of the Rotary Club is on equity and on fairness across the world. And one of the problems with climate change that concerns me a lot is that, to be honest, my family's going to be fine. You know, I think we'll be able to deal with this okay. But poor people, people that are less well off, they're the ones that are going to be impacted by this. And poor countries are going to be impacted by this. So there's a real fairness issue, I think, that's connected to climate change. But thank you for bringing that up. That's great to know. I know about those 6 areas from reading about it in the past, but it's great to know about the new one. Thanks a lot.
Dennis, did you have a question?
Well, Steve Bunker was ahead of me in line, so give him and then I'll jump in.
Apologize, Steve. Go ahead.
No, that's quite all right. Thank you. Remarkable presentation. I thank you for that. And being on the Board of Selectmen, I got an early peek at this when it was presented in front of us. And I was one of those who voted for this to go as a town warrant, because I wanted to encourage public debate and discussion on it. Although I qualified my vote a little bit, and I'll throw just a couple of monkey wrenches into it, and time allowing, giving you a chance to respond to these.
Sure.
In the language itself, I picked up a concern about a return of these investments back to residents, and it failed to speak to the energy costs it would cause to units of state and local government or businesses in their operating expense. And then secondly, I was a little intrigued about it being returned evenly to all residents as opposed to some matrix that would take into account larger consumption or smaller consumption or more economics to individuals' uses. And then third, being a part-time bureaucrat myself, I just have a little bit of a jaundice on anything bureaucratic, particularly federal government, on putting together this system to equate all that goes into the collection and redisbursement itself. So we'll be happy to hear on those points.
You might have to remind me of a couple of those things, but I'll start by responding. I think part of the idea of returning it evenly to all households is that in the long run, lower income people that are spending less already are going to be spending less on fossil fuels and things like that. And so the impact of the increasing costs on everything will be less for them and will be made up by the dividend. Whereas those that spend more money, make more money, et cetera, will be their overall household, expenditures will go up more. And so the dividends won't cover those. So that's sort of the idea of that. Now, again, this is legislation that there could be an income test on, as there are on a lot of things. So, for example, the most recent COVID bill, which, if you make above a certain amount, you don't get a stimulus check from the government. So these are all things that could be modified at the federal level as legislation develops over time. What was the bureaucracy. So I think part of the attraction of this right now is that carbon pricing, again, is going to come. And it's being advocated across the spectrum. And this is the least regulatory idea that's out there. This is an idea that will not create a large bureaucracy. This will be a separate entity where the money will go in and the money will go out. And so I think that's the attraction of this.
Yeah, my third point is it was focused on return just to residents and did not take into account energy costs to state and local governments or business operations.
Yeah, so like any increase in costs that we incur, for example, when energy prices go up, those get passed along to residents. And so those estimates for how this will impact households include that. So they include not just increased costs of gasoline, not just, I think the estimation is, for example, that over about 20 years, that this will add 2% to the cost of an airplane ticket, for example, and will add 1% or 0.5% or something like that to the cost of a television set, television monitor, et cetera. So this includes those additional costs plus the additional costs that will be levied by local and state governments as well, because local and state governments that are paying more in energy costs will have to pass those along as well. And so despite those increases, the dividend that comes back to households will more than make up for that. So that's the idea of how this would work. Does that help explain that, how that works?
I remain open to further discussion.
Okay, that's great. It's good to hear.
Dennis O'Neill.
No, because of the time, I'm going to pass. I just want to say, Andrew, you did a hell of a job. You should do this for a living. And but Steve hit on some of the points that about the economic impact and how I get my share of the dividend. But I'll pass for now and sit and wait by the mailbox.
We are running a little short on time, so I want to thank Dr. Barton for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you all very much. Again, I really appreciate your time.